Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. The scream of rusted metal cut through the pre-dawn dark like the cry of a wounded animal. Wonderland Park had been abandoned for 17 years, yet standing before it, I could swear the place was still breathing shallow, rasping breaths of a forgotten dream refusing to die. I hoisted my camera bag onto my shoulder and stepped out of the rented van, parking just shy of the entrance plaza. Weeds jutted from cracked asphalt like fingers reaching for the light. The headlights caught on a weather-worn sign. "Welcome to Wonderland, where dreams come true." Someone had spray-painted over dreams with the word nightmares, the letters dripping like fresh blood. My hands trembled, not from fear, not yet, but from adrenaline, anticipation. Urban exploration was my passion, and places like this were holy ground. Abandoned amusement parks had a kind of tragic magic to them. At dawn, the golden hour would cast Wonderland in a haunting, surreal beauty. I just had to make it until then. Inside the van, I rolled out my sleeping bag in the cargo space, but rest didn't come easy. The night pressed in from all sides, dense and suffocating. My eyes kept flicking toward the side mirror where the silhouette of the Ferris wheel loomed, its skeletal frame etched against a sky without stars. Even from here, I could see the gondolas hanging like overripe fruit on brittle branches. Then I heard it. A metallic creak, long and low, like old bones groaning. My breath caught. Wind, I told myself. Just wind. But the trees were still. The air outside, unmoving. I leaned toward the window, breath fogging the glass, and watched as one gondola swayed gently. Then another. And then, impossibly, the whole wheel began to turn. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept the beam across the lot. There was no mistaking it. The Ferris wheel, long dead with rust, was moving slow, deliberate, mechanical. Each gondola passed with eerie precision, groaning like it remembered how to move. Then the speakers crackled to life. The sudden burst of static made me flinch, my head smacking the van's ceiling. All around me, the park echoed with a chorus of white noise. But underneath the hiss, something else emerged, breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing. It matched my own, rising in pitch, drawing panic from my chest. Then came the voice. Marcus. It was my voice. Not just similar. It was mine. Recorded perfectly and played back through speakers that shouldn't have worked for decades. Marcus. It's time for the last ride. I scrambled for the keys, hands fumbling, useless. The ignition coughed, clicked, died. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Dead battery. But I'd just driven here. The speakers crackled again. My voice repeating my name, again and again. Each time more distorted, more desperate, unraveling like an old cassette tape rotting in real time. Outside, the Ferris wheel picked up speed. I abandoned the van and bolted into the plaza. The ground felt uneven, like the whole place was shifting beneath my feet. My flashlight flared wildly, catching glimpses of decay. Game booths with shattered glass, their prizes still dangling like trophies from another era. A carousel with wooden horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes tracking my every move. The voice was everywhere now. Not just the PA system. It came from the air itself, from every crack in the pavement, every shadow. My name became a chant, a demand, a threat. I ran. Down the midway, past broken attractions and tilted prize wheels that clicked in time with my racing heart. Stuffed animals stared blankly from behind fractured plexiglass, their button eyes glinting like surveillance cameras. Movement flickered at the edge of my vision. I spun. Nothing. But I could feel it. Something just out of sight, keeping pace, herding me deeper into the park. The funhouse loomed ahead like a yawning mouth, its entrance a jagged grin of shattered mirrors. I didn't want to go in, but my legs carried me forward anyway, like the path had chosen me. Inside, The mirrors twisted my reflection into impossible shapes, versions of myself with too many eyes, arms that bent the wrong way, smiles stretched too wide. The funhouse yawned open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, mirrors lined every wall, reflecting not just my image but versions of myself that felt increasingly wrong. My flashlight's beam ricocheted wildly from surface to surface, strobing the corridor into a maddening blur. I staggered forward, trying not to look too closely. In some mirrors, I saw myself as I was, sweating, panicked, on the edge of collapse. In others, I was already riding the Ferris wheel, my face slack, my eyes blank as a doll's. One reflection made my stomach knot. I stood behind myself, reaching out with hands that were too long, too jointless. Hands that weren't mine. The speakers inside whispered instead of crackled now. The voice was my own, but softer, soothing, coaxing. Promised peace, promised understanding. It told me that all I had to do was return to the wheel and take my seat. The words looped through my brain like a lullaby, each repetition burrowing deeper, becoming less foreign and more reasonable. I broke free of the mirrors, stumbling through a rusted emergency exit, gasping at the night air like a drowning man breaching the surface. My legs shook. Every muscle screamed from the tension, from the fear. And still the Ferris wheel turned. But now it glowed. Each gondola radiated a sickly yellow light, artificial, unnatural. The ground between me and it seemed to fold inward. I blinked, and somehow I was standing right beneath it, though I didn't remember taking a single step. Up close, I saw the truth. The gondolas weren't empty. Each one cradled a figure, flickering like damaged film stock. They wore fashions from every decade, the swing of the 70s, the neon of the 80s, the flannel of the 90s. And every mouth moved in eerie synchronicity, whispering my name. Only one gondola remained unoccupied. Its door hung open, swinging slightly. Waiting. The speakers roared back to life. My voice again, but twisted, pleading, commanding, unraveling. It told me about the others who'd come before me. Explorers, thrill-seekers, dreamers. It said they'd resisted at first too. Fought, ran, hid. But in the end, they all took the ride. And now they were at peace. My hands moved on their own. I reached for the gondola's door. A small, quiet part of me screamed in protest. But the rest of me, the part that had been listening to my own voice for what felt like hours, craved nothing more than to sit down. To stop. To rest. The metal under my fingers was cold. Real. Tangible in a way nothing else in this place had been. I lifted one foot, ready to step in. Then I saw my reflection. Not in a mirror, but in the gondola's window. And it wasn't me. It was someone else wearing my face. Someone who had been here far longer than a single night. Their eyes held that dull, dead glint I'd seen in the others' utter surrender. The shock severed the spell. I staggered backward, fell hard to the concrete. Pain flared in my palms. Beautiful, grounding pain. Pain that reminded me I was still alive. Still me. I ran. No direction. No plan. Just away. The park seemed to fight me. Every path looped back. Every exit morphed into a dead end. But terror is a powerful engine. I crashed through a maintenance fence, tearing my jacket and skin. Overgrown lots clawed at me as I scrambled through branches. Hands bloodied, breath ragged. Behind me, the voice screamed my name, no longer human, barely even sound. Just a vibration in the bones of the world. Somehow, impossibly, I found the van. It leapt out of the darkness and I nearly collided with it. This time, the engine roared to life the second I turned the key. I didn't question the miracle, I just drove. Tires shrieked as I tore out of the plaza. In the rearview mirror, the Ferris wheel still turned, every gondola blazing with that awful yellow glow. And for just a heartbeat, I saw myself again, seated in that once empty car. Waving goodbye, I drove until sunrise, pulled over at a rest stop 50 miles away, hands trembling too hard to keep the wheel straight. In the raw light of day, I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Sleep deprivation, a hallucination brewed by solitude and fear. Almost, because in my camera bag, I found photos I didn't remember taking. Dozens. all of them showing me. Standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, climbing into the empty gondola, smiling with eyes that weren't my own. The timestamps showed they were taken 3 hours after I fled the park. I deleted them, again and again, but they keep coming back. On my camera, on my phone, printed and slid under my apartment door in the middle of the night. Each new set shows me riding a little higher, smiling a little wider, looking a little less human. But it's the voice that's worst. Not from speakers anymore. From inside me. My voice. Patient. Persistent. It whispers that the wheel still turns. That my seat is still empty. That everyone eventually takes the ride. I've moved 3 times. Changed my name. Smashed every piece of photography gear I ever owned. Still, I wake in my car some nights with no memory of leaving my bed. The GPS always points to the same place. Wonderland Park. One day I know I won't fight it. One day I'll take that drive. One day I'll climb inside, and the door will close, and the wheel will start to rise. And I'll smile, and I'll wave, and I'll whisper the name of the next fool with a camera who thinks the dead don't remember being photographed. The wheel is patient. The wheel is waiting. And part of me, God help me, has started to wonder if that's such a bad thing after all. The port never sleeps, but at 3 a.m. it dreams. Nightmares. I've worked the night shift as a crane operator for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the darkness had to offer. Drunk longshoremen stumbling between containers. Rats the size of house cats scurrying through shadows. Even the occasional body, dumped by someone who needed the ocean to keep their secrets. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what waited inside container MSKU 7749823. My name is Marcus Reeves, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 nights ago. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear those whispers. I feel that impossible cold. I see that metal box trembling like it's alive. The shift started like any other. I climbed the narrow ladder to my crane cab, 60 feet above the concrete. My thermos of black coffee already half empty. The port stretched out below me like a vast cemetery of steel rectangles. Each container a potential coffin waiting to be moved. Floodlights carved harsh circles in the dark, leaving everything else to drown in shadow. I settled into my worn seat, the cracked vinyl releasing a familiar squeak that had become my nightly greeting. The radio crackled, dispatch instructing me to start with row G, stack 4. Routine moves. Nothing special. I fired up the spreader and got to work, the mechanical rhythm of lift, swing, lower becoming almost meditative. It was around 1 a.m. when I noticed something was wrong. A single container sat at the edge of the yard, separated from the others by at least 20 feet of empty space. That alone was unusual. Space is money at a port, and we packed them tight. But what really made my skin prickle was the frost. In the middle of August, with temperatures hovering around 75 degrees even at night, this container was covered in a thick layer of ice. Steam, no, not steam. Something denser, colder, rolled off its surface in slow, hypnotic waves. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard. The frost was still there. My supervisor's voice burst through the radio, making me jump. He wanted to know why I'd stopped working. I told him I needed to check something and climbed down from the cab despite his protests. The closer I got to MSKU 7749823, the colder it became. 10 feet away, my breath was misting in the air, my arms erupting in goosebumps beneath my work shirt. The industrial floodlights overhead seemed to dim around the container, as if the darkness it cast was thicker, heavier than regular shadow. I should have walked away. Should have reported it and let someone else deal with whatever was inside. But curiosity, that damned human curse, pulled me closer. The metal surface was covered in a spiderweb of frost patterns, beautiful and terrifying in their complexity. And as I stared, they seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that almost looked like faces. Faces pressing against the inside of the container, mouths open in silent screams. Then I heard it. A sound that made my heart stutter. Thump, thump, exactly matching my heartbeat. Thump, thump. I pressed my ear against the frozen metal, ignoring the burning cold. The rhythm continued, synchronized with the blood pounding in my ears. But beneath it, barely audible, came something else. Whispers. Not in English. Not in Spanish or Mandarin or any of the dozen languages you hear at the port. These were older sounds, guttural and wet, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of seawater. And yet, impossibly, I understood them. They were asking for passage. Passage to land. I jerked back. My ear left a perfect imprint in the frost. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Now I could make out individual voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, pleading in their ancient tongues. The container began to vibrate, a low thrumming I felt in my bones. My radio exploded with static and garbled noise. Through the chaos, I heard my supervisor's voice, demanding to know what the hell I was doing. I tried to respond, but the words stuck in my throat like fishbones. My hands shook as I fumbled with the radio, finally croaking out that I was heading back to the crane. But I didn't move, couldn't move. The whispers had hooks in my mind, pulling me closer. The container's doors faced me, secured with a heavy-duty padlock that looked newer than the rest of the weathered metal. As I stared, frost began to form on the lock, spreading like an infection. The metal groaned and creaked. The padlock shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet night, sending me stumbling backward. The doors remained closed, but now they bulged outward rhythmically, as if something massive was breathing inside. Thump, 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 still matching my heartbeat. Or was my heartbeat matching it? I started noticing changes before I understood what they meant. The air at the port had turned strange, salty, ancient, as though I were breathing inside a sunken ship. The floodlights flickered not at random, but in patterns that felt almost intentional. The ground beneath my boots was no longer solid, but soft, subtly shifting, like concrete melting into wet sand. The whispers changed too. No longer a vague, ambient murmur, they became sharper, more precise. They spoke my name. They knew my thoughts, my memories, things I'd buried deep and fears I'd never spoken aloud. And they offered a bargain: release, liberation from pain, from guilt, from memory. All they needed was passage to land. I didn't mean to move. My body betrayed me. My feet carried me forward without command. My hands reached for the container's doors, container MSKU 7749823, the one we weren't supposed to talk about, the one no one remembered scheduling. The metal handles burned with cold, so intense it seared through my gloves, but still I gripped tighter. Behind the doors, something vast stirred. That's when I saw them, the other crane operators. Johnson, who worked the day shift. Martinez, who retired last year. Chun, who died in that freak accident 3 months ago. They stood silently in a semicircle around the container, their eyes reflecting an eerie blue-white glow radiating from the frost-covered steel. Their mouths moved in perfect unison with the whispers. Chun stepped closer, and I saw right through him, his body a translucent husk. He didn't speak aloud. He didn't need to. His thoughts poured directly into mine. They had all answered the call, all provided passage. And now it was my turn. The doors began to open. What lay inside didn't obey the laws of space or reality. The container's interior stretched impossibly far, a vast tunnel of ice and darkness. The walls pulsed like the flesh of some frozen, living creature. Suspended in that cold abyss drifted forms that may once have been human, but were no longer anything close. They moved like jellyfish in black water, translucent and wrong, trailing tendrils of mist that froze the air around them. One turned to face me. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, an absence filled with alien stars, constellations that did not belong to the sky, constellations that hurt to look at. It reached for me, arms branching endlessly into delicate frozen fractals. The whispers became a roar, a chant. Passage to land, passage to land, passage to land. And then I understood. They weren't asking to come ashore. They wanted me to be the way through, a vessel, a bridge between their world and ours. The other operators hadn't died or left. They'd been hollowed out and inhabited, walking gateways to something beyond comprehension. My hand was on the door, pulling it wider. My arm had gone numb. The cold had crept up past the elbow, turning my skin translucent. My veins were darkening, swelling with something that pulsed and slithered with a will of its own. I was about to step inside. Then I heard it, something that didn't belong to that place. A laugh. A child's laugh, warm and bright, cutting through the impossible cold like sunlight. My daughter's laugh. Not real, of course. She lived 2 states away and hadn't sounded like that since she was 5. But the memory of that laugh, full of life and joy, struck something deep within me. It reminded me of who I was. Marcus Reeves. A man. A father. A human being. Warm, alive, and defiant. I tore my hand from the frozen door, leaving strips of skin behind. The pain was immediate and immense, white-hot agony that burned the fog from my mind. The ghostly operators twisted, their faces contorting in fury. The whispers fractured into shrieks that drilled into my skull. I ran. Behind me, the container slammed shut with a crack of thunder. The ground split, concrete crumbling as something enormous tried to force its way through. The hollow operators pursued, gliding through the air with unnatural grace, like swimmers in water. I reached my crane and scrambled up the ladder, bloody handprints marking every rung. The cab had always felt like a sanctuary, a castle above the chaos. I slammed the door shut. Immediately, the temperature stabilized. The whispers faded to a distant echo. Through the glass, I saw them circling the base of the crane like sharks, their forms losing cohesion with each pass until they finally dissolved into mist. The container sat silent once more. Just another steel box. No frost, no glow. As though nothing had ever happened. I called in sick, voice shaky as I claimed food poisoning. My supervisor bought the lie. I drove home at sunrise, my wounded hand throbbing in time with my racing heart. For the next 2 days I buried myself in research. Port records, shipping manifests, local news archives. MSKU 7749823 didn't exist. Not in any official capacity. But I found other stories. Crane operators vanishing without explanation. Containers arriving unregistered and disappearing just as mysteriously. Legends of things deep in the ocean that should never reach land. I convinced myself it was over. Bills needed paying. Life had to go on. I returned to work. I stayed away from Rogue G. That should have been enough. But last night it wasn't. The container had moved. Now it sat directly in my assigned sector. Frost already forming on the surface, despite security footage showing nothing unusual. According to the manifest, it was scheduled to ship out to Portland. I refused, made up a mechanical issue. They let it slide for now. But I know this is only the beginning. The whispers are back, faint but growing stronger. The cold is returning, and I don't think they'll ask again. Not this time. My hand, the one that had touched the door, had begun to turn translucent at the fingertips, as if the cold had etched itself into me, claiming its peace. They're patient, these things from the deep, patient in ways we can't comprehend. They've waited in the dark water for eons, drifting between cracks in the seabed, whispering through salt and steel. They can wait a little longer, but they will have their passage to land. If not through me, then through another operator, another port, another soul foolish or desperate enough to open doors that were never meant to be touched. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you work the night shift at any port and you see a container covered in impossible frost that forms in humid air, even in the heat of summer, run. If you hear voices speaking in languages you've never learned but somehow understand, don't listen. If they call your name, pretend you don't hear it. If you're curious, fight it. And whatever you do, don't touch the doors. Because once you provide passage, even for a moment, part of you stays behind. Not in this world. Not in any you'd recognize. But in that impossible interior space inside the container. You drift in the dark water between stars, whispering, endlessly whispering to the next fool who gets too close. I can feel it happening to me. Each night I fade a little more. My reflection is growing dimmer, like a candle burning behind thick glass. My thoughts echo with alien tides. I'm forgetting the taste of coffee. the sound of birds. My daughter's laugh is a memory I have to fight for. Soon I'll be standing with the others, around another container in another port, my hollow eyes glowing faint blue in the dark, my mouth moving in unison with the ancient chorus. Passage to land, passage to land, passage to land. The port never sleeps. And now, neither do I. The mountain doesn't forgive. The mountain doesn't forgive, the locals whispered when I asked about the unmarked trail leading up to the thermal springs. Their weathered faces turned away, eyes narrowed, as if even mentioning it summoned something better left undisturbed. But I needed silence more than I needed their warnings. The city had been choking me with deadlines and noise, until I couldn't breathe. The Andes offered solitude, and I was desperate enough to take it. The climb took 6 brutal hours, through terrain that felt deliberately cruel. My lungs burned in the thin air as I followed a barely visible path etched into the mountainside. Each step dislodged stones that tumbled into the abyss below, an abyss that swallowed their echoes and gave nothing back. Up here, silence wasn't peaceful. It was hostile, aggressive, pressing in on my eardrums so forcefully I began to wonder if I'd gone deaf. When I finally reached the springs, I should have been awestruck. Instead, I felt wrong, unwelcome. The pool sat nestled among twisted rock formations, steam rising in lazy spirals from its surface. The stones around it looked like gnarled fingers, reaching skyward. Despite the bubbling water, the place was completely silent. No splashing, no trickling, not even wind, just nothing. I set up camp on a nearby outcrop, hands trembling. I told myself it was the altitude, just the altitude, but my heart beat too fast, and my skin crawled every time I looked at the pool. I felt watched. Still, the water's warmth was inviting. A perfect temperature. Hot enough to ease the tension in my bones, not hot enough to scald. I stripped to my shorts and stepped toward the edge. The silence thickened around me. By the time I knelt to test the water with my hand, it felt like I was underwater already. My reflection wavered across the pool, and for one terrifying second, it wasn't mine. It looked like me, but hollow, empty eyes, a mouth twisted in an endless, silent scream. I blinked. The image was gone. Stress hallucinations, I told myself. My doctor had warned me about this. The body has limits. Sleep deprivation. Too many stimulants. Not enough rest. That's what this was supposed to fix. I stepped into the pool. The heat flooded my system like a drug. My muscles loosened. My nerves relaxed. The tension I'd carried for months began to melt away. I waded deeper, the silence growing thicker with every step. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. That's when I felt it. Something touched my ankle. Just a brush, gentle, almost accidental. I froze. Told myself it was a current. A twig. Something natural. But this pool had no current. And when I looked down, there was nothing to see. Just darkness beneath the surface. The second touch came a moment later. Fingers. Cold fingers. Colder than the boiling water should have allowed. Curled around my ankle with deliberate, intentional pressure. My body locked up. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't scream. The silence had reached inside me. Had stolen my voice. Like it had stolen all sound from the world. I flailed, panicked, my arms slicing through the water as I tried to wrench free. But whatever had me was strong, inhumanly strong, and it was pulling me under. Each heartbeat thundered in my skull as my head tilted back, the mountain sky vanishing in slow, flickering glimpses. The last thing I saw before the water swallowed my face was my reflection again, staring back from the ripples. It wasn't screaming this time. It was smiling. The water closed over my head, and that's when the visions began. Slamming into my consciousness like physical blows, each more vivid and terrifying than the last. I saw a woman in hiking gear, her face blue with oxygen deprivation as she clawed desperately at crumbling rock, trapped in a looping descent that always returned her to the springs, the mountain itself her cruel shepherd. Then a man appeared, affluent and broken, his designer backpack shredded, sitting silently beside the pool with his head in his hands, staring at a lifeless satellite phone that refused to admit the world beyond this ridge still existed. Dozens more followed, each drawn by solitude, now ensnared by the same silence, all slowly unraveling. Their identities fed to a presence that thrived not on screams but on the absence of them. When the grip on my ankle finally loosened, I burst to the surface and gasped for air that tasted of sulfur and dread. My hands shook as I dragged myself onto the ledge, soaked and quivering, and felt the oppressive hush tighten like a noose. It was then I noticed my heartbeat. Gone. That constant, lifelong rhythm had simply ceased, and the terror of its absence drowned out every rational thought. I stumbled back to camp, legs trembling, every instinct screaming to flee. But the trail I had taken hours before now slithered and shifted, a living thing reshaped to trap me. The descent no longer existed, only twisted routes that returned to the steaming pool. Night arrived unnaturally fast, and with it a darkness without moon or stars, thick and aware, pushing into the seams of my tent as I curled into myself, breath shallow and silent. Sleep offered no refuge. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the others, lost, voiceless, drifting through the trees like ghosts, their mouths moving with messages no one could hear. By morning, if it was morning, I made a choice. I wouldn't descend. Couldn't. But there had to be another way. My hands trembled as I packed, limbs heavy, as if the air had turned to syrup. The springs murmured behind me, their silence now swollen with intent. I could feel them watching from beneath the surface, eyes that waited for my return. The mountain didn't simply trap bodies. It consumed need, despair, hunger for peace, and in return offered only a place in its growing ecosystem. The silence wasn't void. It was full of devoured voices, absorbed memories, reassembled souls. Still, I walked. I had to. I followed what might have been a game trail, the world blurring at the edges. Time evaporated. The sky hung unmoving, gray and dull, as if the sun itself were too afraid to intrude. 3 times I returned to the springs, approaching from different angles each time. The 4th time I wasn't alone. A hiker sat slumped on a boulder, beard long, face drawn. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He gestured to his throat, then his ears, panic and recognition burning in his eyes. He thrust a notebook toward me, pages scrawled with desperate handwriting that decayed into madness. The final entry, scrawled in soot or charcoal, read, "It's in the water. It's in the silence. It's in us now." I stumbled back, heart pounding. Not that I could hear it, and he grabbed my arm. His mouth moved. Was it a warning? A plea? An invitation? I didn't know, but I understood. And I knew this mountain would never let me forget it. The people I'd seen in the visions weren't victims. They were bait, lures scattered through time and memory by the thing inside this mountain. Each face, each voice, just another whisper in the dark meant to draw others in. Every person who'd come here believing they'd found peace or escape had become part of its design. Another voice to amplify the quiet. Another set of hands waiting just below the waterline, ready to pull down the next weary traveler who mistook silence for sanctuary. When I understood that, truly understood, I ran. Not out of strategy or hope, but raw instinct. My boots skidded on loose scree. My hands tore against jutting rock. My legs moved faster than my brain. Behind me, the silence gained form. It chased without sound, but with intent, wrapping around my thoughts like vines made of fog and memory. Paths shifted even as I followed them. Landmarks twisted into impossible new shapes. Trees grew and died in the span of seconds. Slopes unfurled beneath me that I knew hadn't been there before. And then, as if I had never left, I was back at the springs. I stood at the edge of the pool, panting, trembling, soaked in sweat and terror. The water had changed. It was darker now, the surface sluggish, viscous. It shimmered like oil. It looked full. Not of bodies, but of failure, of resignation, as though every desperate soul who'd reached this point had dissolved into it, their despair thickening the liquid, adding weight to its silence. My reflection stared up at me, but I wasn't alone. Behind me, behind it, Dozens of faces floated in the mirrored water. Not bodies, just faces, half seen, half formed. Each one wore the same expression, hollow resignation. And I knew them. I didn't know their names, but I knew them all the same. We were part of the same collection now. The silence pressed closer. It wasn't absence anymore. It was presence. It scraped against my skin and pressed into my ears, reaching down my throat like invisible smoke. And something inside me, something vital, bent. Not my heart. Something deeper. Something more essential began to unthread, as if the sound of my own existence was being slowly erased. Escape, I realized, wasn't about trails or maps or cleverness. The mountain didn't operate by logic. It didn't trap people. It transformed them. The moment you arrived, it began hollowing you out. And once that process started, it couldn't be undone. But even as that realization curdled in my gut, something else stirred. A flicker. A faint spark buried beneath the despair. Defiance. I might not leave. I might become one of them. But I didn't have to surrender completely. I could choose which parts of myself to let rot in the silence, and which to keep locked away in a place even the mountain couldn't reach. So I backed away from the springs, not to flee, but to settle, to wait. Perhaps I couldn't stop it, but I could warn the next one. Someone would come. They always did. People like me, broken, searching, too tired to be careful. And when they arrived, I would find a way to tell them. Some silences are too deep to crawl out of. The mountain accepted my new role. It watched without watching, patient as stone, quiet as the grave. And in that stillness I began to plan. But the story didn't end there, because 3 days later, half a world away, the desert began to sing. My name is Marcus. I came to Brazil's Jalapão after my divorce finalized. I'd lost everything. My marriage, my routine, my sense of self. I thought a solo trek across one of South America's most remote wilderness areas might stitch something back together. The landscape promised emptiness. Orange dunes, wind-sculpted formations, ancient rivers that shimmered like glass. What better place to disappear? I carried a week's worth of supplies. I charted my course. I followed the sun. But on the fourth morning, the sand started humming. It began subtly, just a vibration beneath my boots. A low tremble, like thunder too far off to hear properly. I assumed it was the wind, cutting through ridges, creating odd harmonics. But by midday I knew better. Winds don't crescendo. Winds don't harmonize. The dunes began to sing to me. No, not to me, through me. With each step I took, the sound grew richer, fuller. Multiple tones interwove like a choir. I stopped walking. The sound stopped instantly. I stepped again, it resumed. Louder, closer. It wasn't random. It was a response. I stood on the peak of a massive dune, sweat already streaking down my spine despite the early hour. The heat was rising, but the sound had nothing to do with heat. It wasn't in the air, it came from beneath the earth. A resonance that bypassed the ears and buzzed straight into the bones. Still, I told myself it was psychological. A trick of isolation. A product of grief, of being alone too long with too many thoughts. But I had been careful. I wasn't dehydrated. I wasn't delusional. And I wasn't alone. The shadows shifted just beyond my sight. At first I thought it was heat shimmer, mirage. But as I walked into a dune valley, I caught movement. Shapes gliding through the sand like sharks beneath water. They were watching. They had always been watching. And they sang. The voices weren't human. They weren't in any language I knew, but they followed harmonic rules that felt familiar, like old church hymns or whale song or lullaby sung in dreams. They were beautiful in a terrible way. Too perfect. Too practiced. Like they'd been sung forever. And then, beneath the chorus, I heard something else. Water. Not running. Not trickling. Boiling. Boiling without bubbles. Hissing without steam. I stopped at the edge of a rise and looked down, and there it was. A pool. In the middle of the desert. Impossible. The surface didn't ripple. It was like obsidian, thick and motionless. I knew without knowing that if I stepped into it, I'd never leave. Not physically. Not as myself. The song behind me swelled. It wanted me to go down, to join. And then, for a split second, I saw them. Faces in the reflection. Dozens. Some I knew. One I almost recognized. A man with haunted eyes and a scraggly beard, standing at the edge of another pool, in another land. And in his eyes, a flicker of something I carried too. Defiance. The singing grew louder. The water beckoned. But I took a step back. The voices screamed in silence. I pitched my small tent in the lee of a dune, the wind whispering across the sand like a breath drawn in before a scream. The canvas flapped weakly as I crawled inside, grateful for even the minimal shade it provided. My skin was tight with sunburn, lips cracked and stinging, and the grit of the desert had infiltrated every seam of my clothing. Yet even here, pressed low against the cooling sand with only a thin layer of synthetic fabric separating me from the endless wasteland, I could feel it. The vibrations. They came up through the earth in subtle pulses, a tremor that resonated in my ribs and molars. The singing was stronger now, not louder, deeper. It had evolved from an indistinct hum to something structured, deliberate. A complex arrangement of voices wove themselves together in the air, an alien chorus of sound that bypassed the ears and nestled itself directly in the nervous system. I could pick out individual threads now, low, thrumming bass lines that pulsed like blood through arteries, soaring soprano fragments that curled like smoke into the darkening sky. Intricate harmonies braided themselves together into patterns that felt significant, sacred in a way that made my teeth ache and my spine twitch involuntarily. I tried to sleep. God knows I tried. But each time I drifted near the edge of unconsciousness, something would jerk me awake. My name, I was certain of it, spoken in a tone just beyond comprehension, woven seamlessly into the melody. Rationality insisted it was my imagination, a trick of stress and exhaustion. But out here, where the horizon itself shimmered and broke apart under the weight of heat and mirage, rationality felt like a paper umbrella in a sandstorm. Everything real was unraveling. When the sun began to dip low, bleeding gold across the western dunes, I broke camp with trembling hands and set off southward. That was the plan. Stick to the coordinates, keep moving, get out before nightfall. But with each dragging step, the singing grew more intense, more insistent, urgent, beautiful beyond articulation, terrifying in the way a void might be if it suddenly opened its mouth and began to sing back. And then I saw the first face. It rose silently from the dune just ahead of my right foot, the slope breaking open like a sigh to reveal it. A face, clear and deliberate, formed entirely from sand. Its features were sculpted in quartz and feldspar, every contour catching the dying light in fractured glints. The eyes were not eyes, but shadows that shifted with depthless suggestion. And the mouth moved, soundless, words forming silently. Behind it, the chorus deepened. I staggered back, nearly falling as the weight of my pack pulled me sideways. And as my boots disturbed the ground beneath me, more faces bloomed from the sand. They erupted in silence where my feet had just been, countless visages sculpted in fine granules, their expressions stretched into frozen masks of longing and loss, all of them gazing upward, reaching, trying to claw their way into form, to speak, to be. The air was heavy with sound now, no longer a distant hum, but a full-throated, multi-layered symphony. It seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere, vibrating the air with impossible precision. Beneath the melody I heard whispers, distinct, fragmented syllables in a language that slipped from memory even as I tried to capture it. Words that didn't belong in the human mouth. When I repeated them aloud, they twisted painfully on my tongue, leaving an aftertaste like ash and static. Stay, the faces seemed to say. Though their lips moved in patterns that matched no human language, the meaning surged into my mind unbidden, like a forgotten dream resurfacing. Learn the song. Learn the whole song. Panic seized me. My heart jackhammered against my ribs as I tore my pack open and fumbled for the GPS. My fingers were clumsy, sweat-slick, trembling. I clutched the device like a talisman, willing it to offer structure, a path, something, but the screen was nothing but static. No coordinates. No satellite signal. Just jittering white noise and meaningless interference. I ran. Sand exploded beneath my boots with every desperate step. Faces burst from the ground in my wake, blooming like terrible, silent flowers. The song was everywhere now. No longer music, but a force, a pressure that invaded my body, warped my perception. Notes rose in dizzying crescendos, stacking atop each other until they created impossible chords that turned the world into glass and resonance. My backpack slammed into my spine as I half slid, half fell down the face of a dune. But I didn't dare stop. The chorus had breached a new threshold. Frequencies that blurred my vision, made the air viscous and difficult to breathe. The sand was moving around me, flowing in currents that pulsed with light. Faces surged up in widening rings, their mouths locked in that same desperate expression. The whole song. Stay and learn the whole song. My legs were jelly. I crested the next dune on sheer adrenaline. And then, a valley. A bowl of sand stretching wide and endless, filled with hundreds, thousands of faces. An entire congregation of silicate worshippers, all turned toward me. Their eyes were pools of nothing. Their mouths shaped words that left no sound but implied meaning, projected into my soul like arrows of light. The chorus grew beyond orchestral now. It was architecture, a cathedral of sound that bent the rules of acoustics, that carved the air into shapes, made the bones in my skull hum with sympathetic resonance. I realized, with bone-deep dread, that I wasn't escaping. Every frantic step forward only drew me deeper. I was being led, pulled, guided toward the center of something vast and patient. The faces were changing, becoming more defined, more familiar. Some wore expressions I recognized. Eyes I'd seen in mirrors, in photo albums, in the dreams that dissolve with morning light. Childhood friends, dead relatives, my ex-wife's mother, whose disapproving stare I hadn't thought of in years. They looked back at me with mournful recognition, as if I were the one returning home. The melody had breached my skull. It vibrated in my bones. I pressed my palms against my ears, screamed, begged for silence. But it was inside now. Inside me, my marrow had joined the chorus. Night came suddenly, like the flipping of a switch. The stars above spun in alien constellations, unfamiliar and unmoored. And still, the faces glowed, soft phosphorescent light radiating from beneath the sand. My mind scrambled for explanations. Bioluminescence, I told myself. Some rare microorganism disturbed by my movement. But microorganisms don't make eye contact. Don't follow you. Don't mouth your name. My compass was useless. The needle spun lazily, drunk on magnetic nonsense. Time itself unraveled. Minutes stretching into hours, hours collapsing into seconds. The only constants were the faces, the singing, and the unbearable, inescapable sense that I was no longer walking through something. I was being absorbed by it. And still the faces sang. And still they begged. Stay, they whispered. Learn the whole song. I erected my small tent in the lee of a dune, crawling inside, grateful for even the minimal shade it provided. But even pressed against the sand, separated from it only by a thin layer of fabric, I could feel the vibrations. The singing had grown more complex, more insistent. Within the chorus, individual voices emerged. A deep bass line, soaring soprano melodies, intricate harmonies that made my teeth ache. I tried to sleep but kept jerking awake, convinced I heard my name woven into the wordless songs. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, but rationality felt increasingly fragile out here, where the horizon shimmered with heat mirages and the very ground beneath me had apparently found its own voice. When the sun began its slow descent toward the western dunes, I broke camp and continued south toward my planned exit point. But with every step, the singing grew more urgent, more beautiful, more terrifying. The harmonies ascended now, climbing scale by scale toward some unseen crescendo that made my nerve endings sing in sympathetic resonance. Then I saw the first face. It emerged from the sand just ahead of my right foot as I crested another dune. Features molded from grains of quartz and feldspar, eyes deeper shadows in the shifting surface. The mouth moved as if forming words, though the only sound was that eternal chorus growing ever more complex around me. I stumbled backward, my pack throwing me off balance. More faces appeared where my feet had been, expressions of profound longing etched in the malleable sand. They seemed to be reaching upward, trying to break free of their granular prison. The singing was definitely louder now. No longer a hum, but a full-throated chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And underneath the melody, I could swear I heard whispered words in a language I didn't recognize, syllables that felt ancient and wrong in my mouth when I tried to repeat them. Stay. The faces seemed to be saying, though their lips moved in patterns that didn't match any human language. Learn the song. Learn the whole song. Panic flooded my system with adrenaline. My hands shook as I fumbled for my GPS unit, desperate to confirm my location and plot the fastest route out of this place. But the screen showed only static, the satellite signal apparently blocked by some invisible interference. I ran. The sand erupted beneath my feet with each pounding step, faces blooming like deadly flowers in my wake. The chorus exploded into a symphony, dozens of voices climbing toward notes that human ears weren't meant to process. My backpack bounced painfully against my spine as I half slid, half tumbled down the dune's face, but I dared not slow down. Behind me, the singing reached a pitch that made my vision blur. The very air thickened, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. More faces emerged from the sand around me, no longer confined to my footprints but spreading outward in concentric circles, each one mouthing the same silent plea. The whole song, they seemed to say. Stay and learn the whole song. My lungs burned as I crested another dune, legs shaking with exhaustion. But ahead, impossibly, was another valley filled with even more faces, a congregation of sand-carved worshippers, all turning toward me with empty, yearning eyes. The chorus swelled to orchestral proportions, harmonies so complex they seemed to bend the laws of acoustics. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't escaping at all. Each step forward, each desperate attempt to flee, was somehow drawing me deeper into whatever this was. The faces grew more detailed, more expressive. Some seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. Others looked like crude sketches of faces I'd known and lost. Childhood friends, deceased relatives, my ex-wife's mother who had always disapproved of me. The singing was inside my head now, resonating in my skull like the world's most beautiful torture device. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it made no difference. The melody was coming from within, as if my own bones had joined the chorus. Night fell with tropical suddenness, but the faces in the sand began to glow with their own phosphorescent light. Bioluminescence, my rational mind insisted, just some kind of microorganism activated by my footfalls. But organisms don't arrange themselves into human features, don't maintain eye contact as you stumble past them in the darkness. I had lost all sense of direction. The stars wheeled overhead in unfamiliar configurations, and my compass needle spun lazily without settling on any particular bearing. The only constant was the singing, the faces, and the growing certainty that something vast and patient was drawing me toward its center. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed as fluid as the sand beneath my feet. I found myself walking in rhythm with the chorus, my steps matching the meter of their impossible song. Part of me recognized this as a dangerous development, but a larger part was beginning to understand the beauty of what I was hearing, the mathematical precision of the harmonies, the way each voice supported and elevated the others in perfect acoustic architecture. When dawn finally broke, I discovered I'd been walking in a vast spiral. My GPS track described a perfect logarithmic curve centered on a depression between three towering dunes. At the spiral's heart, the sand had formed itself into an amphitheater of faces, thousands of them arranged in concentric circles like the world's most impossible choir. They were all looking at me, all mouthing the same silent words. Stay and learn the song, the whole song. The music reached a crescendo that should have shattered my eardrums, but instead filled me with a euphoria I'd never experienced. Every cell in my body vibrated in harmony with the chorus. For one terrifying moment, I understood what they were asking. This wasn't madness or hallucination. This was an invitation to join something eternal, something beautiful beyond human comprehension. The song had gaps in it, spaces where my voice was meant to fit. I could feel the melody pulling at my vocal cords, demanding completion. All I had to do was open my mouth and sing along, and I would understand everything. The faces would welcome me. The sand would embrace me. I would never be alone again. My lips parted. The first note built in my throat. But something in me, some stubborn human defiance, some desperate clinging to my own identity, made me bite down hard on my tongue instead. Pain flooded my mouth, coppery and sharp, shocking me back into something resembling rational thought. I turned and ran, not toward any exit or destination, just away from the amphitheater of faces and their seductive harmonies. The chorus followed me, growing more urgent, more beautiful, more devastating with each step. But I kept running, kept biting my tongue whenever I felt the urge to join their song. The sun climbed higher. My water ran out. Heat mirages danced around me like wraiths, and the faces in the sand began to look more desperate, more pleading. But gradually, incrementally, the singing began to fade. By late afternoon, as I stumbled out of the dune field and onto the relatively solid ground of the Cerrado proper, the chorus had diminished to a distant whisper. The faces still appeared occasionally in patches of loose sand, but they seemed smaller now, less distinct, less real. I didn't stop walking until I reached the highway. 2 days later, dehydrated and sunburned but undeniably human. The rangers who picked me up attributed my condition to heat exhaustion and mild hallucinations brought on by isolation. I let them believe that explanation because the alternative was impossible to convey. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment back in Sao Paulo, I can still hear echoes of that chorus. Fragments of the song that wanted to complete itself through me. And part of me, a part that grows stronger each day, wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. If I'd learned just one more verse. The sand remembers. It's still singing, waiting patiently for someone to help it finish its eternal song. Someone braver than I was. Someone willing to become part of something larger, more beautiful, and infinitely more terrifying than any single human voice could ever be. I should forget. I should let the experience fade into the category of trauma-induced delusion where it belongs. But I find myself researching flights back to Brazil, studying maps of the Jalapa, planning another trek into those singing dunes. Because deep down, in a place I don't want to acknowledge, I know the truth. The song isn't finished, and neither am I. The fluorescent lights in Estacio de Luz flickered with a dying rhythm, matching the weary beat of my heart. Something felt off the moment I descended those concrete steps. But exhaustion had dulled my instincts, whisper-thin warnings I chose to ignore. The digital clock above the platform glowed 11:47 p.m. when I finally reached the subway station. My shift at the accounting firm had stretched past midnight again, leaving me among the dregs of Sao Paulo's night commuters. The few remaining passengers looked as hollow-eyed as I felt, their faces intermittently illuminated by the stuttering overhead lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. My phone showed no signal down here, which wasn't unusual, but tonight, something about the silence was different. Usually, even at this hour, you could hear the distant rumble of trains moving through other tunnels, the electronic announcements echoing from adjacent platforms. Tonight, there was only the oppressive weight of concrete and steel pressing down from above, and the occasional drip of water falling from unseen cracks in the ceiling. When the train finally arrived, its headlight cut through the murky tunnel like a searchlight. It seemed older than the usual fleet. The blue and white paint was faded, almost sepia-toned under the platform lights. Fatigue made me careless about details. I just wanted to get home. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded more labored than usual. Only 3 other passengers sat scattered throughout the car, each staring at nothing with the glazed expression of the terminally tired. I claimed a seat near the middle, my reflection ghostly in the window as the train pulled away from the platform. The first sign that something was wrong came after what should have been Estacio Republica. I'd made this journey hundreds of times and knew every stop, every curve in the track. But the announcements weren't coming. The stations we passed looked different, older. The tilework seemed more weathered, the lighting dimmer, a tired orange hue instead of the bright white LEDs I was accustomed to. My heart began a slow, steady climb toward my throat as I struggled to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew. The woman across from me hadn't moved since I boarded. Neither had the man in the business suit near the door, or the teenager with the worn leather jacket at the far end of the car. They sat like mannequins, perfectly still, their breathing so shallow I had to strain to detect the rise and fall of their chests. The train began to slow, and I felt that familiar sensation of brakes engaging, but there should have been no stop here. According to my mental map, we were traveling through a section of tunnel that ran uninterrupted for several kilometers. Yet ahead, I could see the glow of platform lights approaching. When we finally stopped, the doors slid open onto a station I had never seen before. The platform stretched away in both directions, far longer than any station I knew on this line. The walls were covered in white tiles, but not the crisp, modern white of recent renovations. These tiles had the cream-colored patina of age, many cracked or missing entirely. The lighting came from incandescent bulbs housed in fixtures that looked like they belonged to another era. But it was the advertisements that made my blood run cold. Every poster, every billboard, every advertisement visible on the platform walls showed products and styles from decades past. A woman in a paisley dress smiled at me from a cigarette ad, her hair styled in the voluminous fashion I'd only seen in my mother's old photo albums. Next to it, a man with thick sideburns promoted a brand of television I'd never heard of. The typography, the color schemes, the photographic quality, all screamed 1974. My mouth went dry as I stepped off the train, legs unsteady beneath me. The platform felt solid enough, real enough, but the air carried a staleness that reminded me of sealed rooms and forgotten places. Behind me, I heard the train doors slide shut, followed by the familiar whining acceleration of electric motors. But when I turned to watch it disappear into the tunnel, something made my knees nearly buckle. The tracks behind the train simply ended in darkness. Not the darkness of a tunnel extending beyond the reach of platform lights, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light itself. From that void came the continuous sound of the train I had just left, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the electric hum of motors, the occasional squeal of brakes, as if it were still there, still moving, but existing in some space I could no longer see or reach. I spun around, my breathing shallow and rapid. The other passengers from the train were nowhere to be seen. The platform was completely empty except for me, stretching away into shadows that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A bead of cold sweat traced its way down my spine as I approached one of the advertisement boards. The paper felt real under my fingertips, slightly rough and yellowed with age. The date in the corner of a newspaper stand poster confirmed my worst fear, 15 Diero 1974. My heart hammered against my ribs. As I tried to process what I was seeing, disbelief gnawed at me. This couldn't be real. Stations didn't just appear and vanish. Time didn't work like this. But the evidence was undeniable and all wrong. I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space, but there was no response. The sound seemed absorbed by the walls themselves, muffled and distorted until it barely resembled human speech. When the echo finally faded, the silence that replaced it felt heavier than before, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. That's when I noticed the security cameras. They were old dome-style models mounted high on the walls, but they tracked my every movement with unnerving precision, almost as if they were alive. As I walked along the platform searching for an exit, each camera swiveled to follow me. Their mechanical whirring was barely audible, but constant, like metallic breathing. The exit signs I finally found were written in a font style I didn't recognize, though the Portuguese was clear enough. But the corridors they indicated led only to more empty passages, walls plastered with those time-displaced advertisements, endless intersections branching off into shadowy corridors. My palms slicked with sweat, my shirt clinging uncomfortably to my back despite the cool air. Each breath felt insufficient, as if this place's atmosphere contained less oxygen than it should. I began to run, my footsteps echoing in a rhythm that seemed to multiply, creating the impression I was being followed by invisible companions, matching my pace. The deeper I ventured into this impossible station, the more distorted everything became. Corridors that should have led back to the platform curved away into darkness. Staircases that promised access to street level abruptly ended at blank walls. And everywhere, those cameras followed me with their unblinking mechanical eyes. In one particularly long hallway, I discovered a newsstand, still fully stocked with magazines and newspapers dated from 1974. The vendor's chair sat empty behind the counter but still warm. When I pressed my palm to the seat cushion, it was almost like someone had just left. A cup of coffee on the small table beside it was still steaming, though no one was there. The magazines themselves were wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The text was in Portuguese, the layout and design perfectly matching the era. But the stories described events that hadn't happened. Political scandals involving people I'd never heard of, sports results from teams that didn't exist, weather reports for cities with impossible names. I grabbed one of the newspapers, hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it. The front page featured a photograph of the very station I stood in, bustling with commuters in 1970s attire. The headline read, Nova Estação Temporal Inundada Portal para Viadura. The paper slipped from my numb fingers as the implications hit me like a punch. This wasn't just an abandoned station or an elaborate hoax. According to what I just read, this place had been designed specifically to trap people like me. People from the future who had somehow stepped outside their proper time. Behind me, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. All the cameras turned to focus on the spot where I stood, their mechanical whirring growing louder, more insistent. That's when I understood. I wasn't alone here. The other passengers from the train hadn't disappeared. They were still here somewhere, lost in this maze of impossible architecture and temporal displacement. And based on how those cameras tracked movements I couldn't see, based on footsteps with no source, I began to suspect there were many more people trapped here than just the handful I had traveled with. People from different times, different decades, all caught in the same temporal snare. The realization tightened my chest with panic. How long had this place been operating? How many late-night commuters had taken that last train and found themselves deposited in this pocket of displaced time? Were they all still here, invisible to each other but present nonetheless, wandering these endless corridors forever? I pressed my back against the cold tile wall, trying to steady my breathing. There had to be a way out. The train had brought me here, so logic dictated that another train could take me back. But the tracks behind my arrival point had simply ended in void. As if answering my thoughts, I heard it again, the distant sound of an approaching train. The rhythmic clacking of the train's wheels grew louder in the stillness, accompanied by the sharp, grinding squeal of brakes engaging. My heart thundered in my chest, pounding with a desperate hope I barely dared to entertain. I sprinted through the twisting corridors, chasing the sound, though the walls seemed to shift and rearrange themselves with every frantic step I took, as if the station itself was alive and deliberately confusing me, folding space around me like a labyrinth without end. When I finally burst onto a platform, I hesitated, struggling to catch my breath. Whether this was the same platform where I'd first arrived, I couldn't say. The details were already blurring, memories dissolving in the haze of fear and confusion. The train waiting there was different, older, faded and worn in a way that seemed almost deliberate. Its paint was chipped and peeling, dulled by decades of neglect. The windows were smaller, clouded with grime, and through the glass I saw passengers seated inside. Their clothes were unmistakably from another era. Decades earlier, heavy wool coats, hats tipped low, dresses and trousers that belonged to a time before I'd even been born. The doors hissed open with the same pneumatic sigh I'd heard before, but this time it sounded like the weary exhale of something exhausted beyond endurance. A tired machine surrendering at last. I froze at the threshold, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. To step onto this train was to risk vanishing even further from home, plunging deeper into the impossible temporal maze this place represented. Yet to remain meant accepting my fate, condemned to roam these endless, empty corridors forever, watched by cold mechanical eyes, haunted by the echo of invisible footsteps that matched my own. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight, knowing in my gut that there was no real choice. The pull was too strong, the promise of movement too tempting. I stepped aboard. The doors slid closed behind me with a final, lingering hiss, and as the train lurched forward I caught a reflection in the grimy window. A man looking back at me, but not me. His clothes were unfamiliar, his face older, etched with lines and weariness that shouldn't have been there. It was a version of myself I couldn't recognize, a shadow cast by time's cruel hand. The train moved slowly into the darkness, swallowed by tunnels that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the realm of any known time. Behind us, the platform lights flickered and dimmed, fading away until they became little more than ghosts of a place that should not exist. And in the distance, faint but persistent, I heard it, the echo of that first train's wheels, the one that had brought me here, still running its eternal circuit through this timeless maze. I closed my eyes tightly and tried to steady my breathing, but my mind raced with a terrifying thought. How many versions of me were already riding these tracks? How many others like me were trapped, scattered through the folds of time, all searching for a way home that might never have existed at all? The train rocked gently as it carried me further into the unknown. Outside, the world was gone, replaced by shadows and silence and the creeping dread of eternal displacement. With steel-gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that seemed to pierce through me rather than merely look at me, Mrs. Hartwell led me inside without a word of small talk. Her slippers made no sound at all on the worn wooden floors, as if she was part of the house itself, moving silently and deliberately through its shadows. The guest room she showed me was sparse but meticulously clean, with a single window framing a view of the vast sunflower field beyond. As she walked me through the house, Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that dinner would be served at 7 and warned me to be careful walking the property after dark. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Not the usual cautious advice about uneven ground or the hazards of farm equipment, but a warning heavy with urgency and unspoken threat. When I pressed her for details, she simply refused to elaborate, her expression tightening into something unreadable. Dinner passed in near silence. The food was good, hearty, and wholesome, but I found myself struggling to swallow, my throat tightening with a nameless anxiety. Mrs. Hartwell watched me eat with those penetrating, unsettling eyes, occasionally nodding to herself as if confirming something only she could see. When I casually mentioned my plan to photograph the sunflowers at midnight, she set down her fork with deliberate care. Her voice lowered, becoming serious, almost reverent as she told me the flowers behaved strangely during the full moon, that I might witness things challenging my understanding of the natural world. She urged me to stay close to the house, to keep the porch light in sight at all times, and under no circumstances to venture into the heart of the field. When I pressed for more details, she only said the farm had its own rhythms and needs, and that outsiders who respected those rhythms were welcome to stay. I retired to my room at 10 o'clock, ostensibly to rest before my midnight shoot, but sleep was impossible. The silence outside was so complete it seemed to press against the walls, making my ears ring. I lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat, which thundered unnaturally loud in the dead air. At 11:30, I gave up trying to rest and began preparing my camera gear. Despite years of experience, the equipment felt foreign in my hands. My fingers fumbled with familiar straps and settings. I double-checked my light meter 3 times before trusting its reading. Something about the place unsettled me, warping my equilibrium. Even the simplest tasks felt strange and uncertain. I slipped quietly out the back door at 1:15, wanting to avoid disturbing Mrs. Hartwell. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow, reaching only about 20 feet into the darkness. Beyond that, the world vanished into absolute black. I'd brought a powerful flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam seemed to die just a few yards ahead, swallowed by the impenetrable night. The sunflowers loomed above me like silent giants, their massive heads turned away from the house, facing east toward where the moon would soon rise. Even in the darkness, I felt their presence. Thousands upon thousands of them standing still and patient in perfect rows. The stalks were easily 8 feet tall, their leaves rustling with the same whispering sound I'd noticed earlier, though no wind stirred the still air. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped slowly into the field, following one of the narrow dirt paths between the towering rows. The darkness seemed to pulse and breathe around me. I found myself taking short, shallow breaths, as if the very air had thickened, resisting each inhale. Every few steps, I paused to glance back at the house, reassuring myself that the porch light was still there, still a faint beacon of safety in the engulfing blackness. 20 feet into the field, my flashlight began to flicker. I shook it, checked the batteries I had just installed, but the beam continued to weaken and pulse erratically. The darkness seemed to press closer, thick and heavy, and I became acutely aware that I could no longer hear my footsteps on the dirt path. The silence was so complete, so absolute, that even sound seemed to be absorbed by the waiting sunflowers. At 5 minutes to midnight, the first change began. A subtle shift in the air pressure, like the tense moment before a thunderstorm breaks, made my ears pop. Suddenly I could hear my heart again, pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. Then the sunflower heads began to move. Slowly, deliberately, row after row of massive flowers swiveled away from the east, turning to face me. I stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in my grip, as thousands of those enormous flower faces regarded me with their dark, hollow centers. There was no sound in the movement, utterly silent, but I could feel it in my bones. A deep, low vibration emanating from the earth itself. The sunflower's synchronized gaze pressed on me like a tangible force. Row after row of towering blooms turned their attention toward the small, warm figure standing among them. I understood with primitive certainty that I was no longer alone. The moon crested the horizon at exactly midnight, full and brilliant white, casting the field in sharp silver relief. The sunflowers completed their turn in perfect synchronization, their faces oriented toward the lunar disk. Then I saw what Mrs. Hartwell had tried to warn me about. The shadows cast by the flowers were wrong. Where each sunflower's shadow should have been the simple silhouette of stalk and bloom, I saw unmistakable shapes of human figures, men and women of various heights and builds. Their shadowy arms reached toward me, their shadow heads turned to track my every movement. I stumbled backward, toward the house, but I wasn't moving at all. My feet were rooted, unmoving. The shadows continued to shift and reach independently of their sources. And worse, my own shadow, cast by the moonlight streaming over my shoulder, was no longer attached to my feet. It stood several yards away, watching me with a posture of patient interest. Then the voices began. The chorus started as a whisper, barely audible above the rushing blood in my ears. A dozen voices, then 50, then hundreds, all speaking in unison, emanating from deep within the field. They welcomed me to the cycle. They invited me to join the eternal dance of the seasons. They promised peace, purpose, belonging. The words seemed to come from the earth itself, resonating through my boots and up into my chest cavity until I could feel them vibrating in my teeth and skull. Welcome to the cycle. Welcome to the cycle. Welcome to the cycle. My legs began moving without my permission, carrying me deeper into the field. The shadow figures beckoned from every direction, their forms growing more detailed and defined with every step I took away from the house. Faces appeared now, expressions serene, content, arms extended in greeting. My own detached shadow walked beside me, perfectly in step, occasionally reaching out as if to take my hand. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but my body continued its involuntary march toward the heart of the field. I tried to turn and run back to the house, but my muscles ignored every command. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with dawning terror that other voices were joining the chorus. Fresh voices, recent voices, belonging to those who had once stood exactly where I now stood. 50 yards from the house, 100, 200, the porch light dwindled behind me, shrinking to a pale star before vanishing entirely behind the towering wall of sunflowers. I was surrounded, trapped in a living labyrinth of stalks and shifting shadows, each narrow path bending inward toward a center I couldn't see but felt in my marrow. Something was pulling me, unseen but irresistible, like a great magnet lodged at the heart of the field. My camera thudded against my chest with each step. Forgotten now. Sweat streamed down my face despite the cool October night, and my breath came in ragged, panicked bursts. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to resist this force that had hijacked my body. But I remained helpless, a marionette sleepwalking toward doom. Then the stalks parted into a clearing, a perfect circle perhaps 30 feet across. At its center stood a single sunflower, impossibly tall, its massive head turned up toward the moon like a worshipper in trance. Around its thick stem, every shadow from the field had gathered dozens, maybe hundreds, forming a writhing congregation of human silhouettes, arms outstretched in silent adoration and need. As I stepped to the edge of the circle, my feet froze in place. The shadows turned to face me. I saw them clearly now. They were people, or had been. Farmers in faded overalls, women in prairie dresses, children in outdated clothes. Their details flattened into two-dimensional forms, like old photographs burned into the night. Eyes met mine, filled with sorrow and something worse, hunger. The chanting around me rose, reaching a crescendo. The sunflower began to glow, not with golden sunlight, but with cold, silvery luminescence, like moonlight turned solid. The light bled into everything, harsh and unforgiving. I felt it pierce my skin, bore into my bones. It was pulling something from me, not flesh, not blood, something deeper. My shadow, my reflection, the piece of me that proved I was still human. Terror surged through me, but so did defiance. Maybe it was the stubborn eye of a photographer. Maybe just dumb resistance. Either way, I forced my trembling hands to lift the camera. The movement felt like swimming through syrup, but I raised the lens, focused on the giant sunflower, and peered through the viewfinder. What I saw through the lens wasn't what my eyes showed me. Silver threads stretched between the flower and each of the shadows, binding them like puppets to a master, feeding it, sustaining it. And then I saw mine, my thread already spun, already thickening. I pressed the shutter. The flash exploded, bright and blinding, slicing through the silver gloom like lightning. In that moment, something broke. The spell loosened. My limbs were mine again. I ran. I tore through the field, shoving past stalks with desperate strength, chasing the fading afterimage of the porch light scorched into my vision. Behind me, the chorus of shadows shrieked, not in welcome, but in rage. Denied, robbed of another. I burst into the yard, stumbled up the steps, and slammed against the farmhouse door. Mrs. Hartwell was waiting in the kitchen, fully dressed despite the hour. Her eyes shimmered not just with relief, but with something like approval. "You're stronger than most," she said quietly. "Few make it back once they reach the heart." She told me the truth, then, matter of fact, like she was explaining the weather. The farm had always been like this. The sunflowers needed to feed. Those they took became part of the cycle. And those who were taken, "They don't seem unhappy," she said. She offered me coffee and a seat, told me I could stay until morning. But she gently warned me to leave before the next full moon, if I valued my freedom. I sat in that kitchen until dawn, hands clenched around a warm mug, trying to make sense of what had happened. When the sun finally rose, Mrs. Hartwell walked me to the door and handed me a manila envelope. "Payment," she said, "for your photography services." I hadn't given her any pictures. I developed the film a week later, in my darkroom hundreds of miles away. Most of the frames were garbage, blurred, overexposed, full of panic and moonlight. But one shot came out perfect. The final image, the sunflower, enormous and glowing, ringed by its congregation of shadows. And near the edge of the frame, my shadow, beginning to peel away from my feet, stretching toward the flower with the same desperate hunger I'd seen in the others. I keep that photo in a safety deposit box. I don't know why. Maybe to remind myself it was real. Maybe to remind myself how close I came. Sometimes, on full moon nights, I think about Mrs. Hartwell's words, that those who join the cycle seem content enough. But I've never gone back. And I never will. The envelope Mrs. Hartwell gave me held more than money. At the bottom, folded small and yellowed with age, was a newspaper clipping dated 1987. The headline read, "Local photographer missing after assignment at rural farm." The article described a man whose camera had been found abandoned in a sunflower field. His body was never recovered. His name was David Martinez, 34 years old, unmarried, and an agricultural photographer. Just like me. The resemblance was uncanny. The article read like an obituary written in advance, for me. If I hadn't broken free, if that final camera flash hadn't severed whatever supernatural tether was pulling me under, I'd have vanished like him. Another shadow swallowed by the cycle. Another silent voice in that eternal chorus, waiting to welcome the next photographer who heeded the farm's strange summons. I burned the clipping that night, but I've never forgotten the look on those shadowy faces in the clearing, serene, fulfilled. Sometimes, in that fragile space between sleep and waking, I wonder if I made the wrong choice in running. The world outside the farm feels harsher now. Deadlines, disappointments, the slow erosion of meaning in work that feels more hollow each day. But then morning comes. I see my shadow, securely stitched to my heels, and I remember the price of that other kind of peace. I remember the hungry gravity of silver light, the way my limbs moved without my will, the chilling truth that some kinds of belonging come at costs too steep to pay. The Hartwell farm still stands, still advertising in tiny classifieds tucked into obscure corners of small-town newspapers. Mrs. Hartwell, I imagine, still waits in that spotless kitchen, offering warm warnings about sunflowers under the full moon. And somewhere in those endless fields, thousands of shadows hold their eternal vigil, silent, watchful, always ready to welcome new souls into the fold. I don't shoot farms anymore. I photograph people now, portraits mostly. I always make sure their shadows show up in the frame. Fully attached, counted for, is good work. Honest, pays well enough. But sometimes, when the light hits just right and shadows stretch long and crisp across the pavement, I catch myself listening. Listening for that distant chorus. An invitation to surrender the chaos of individuality and merge into something larger, something permanent. And on certain nights, when the moon is full, I have to resist the urge to flip through the classifieds again. My inner ear began to deceive me. I couldn't tell if we were turning in circles or not moving at all. The steady thrum of the engine beneath my feet was the only constant. A mechanical heartbeat that should have offered comfort but instead filled me with a deepening sense of unease. I staggered back toward my car, hands blindly stretched out to navigate through the thick fog. When my fingers finally found metal and glass, I nearly sobbed with relief at the familiar contours of the door handle. Something solid, something real, something that hadn't yet dissolved into this creeping nightmare. But just as I reached for the handle, the voice began. It was a woman's voice, smooth as silk, rich and warm like aged whiskey or expensive chocolate. It seemed to pour directly into my ear, even though I knew it came from the same hidden speakers that had been piping in that relentless carnival music. Hypnotic, beautiful, and utterly terrifying in its intimacy. She spoke in Portuguese, but her accent was strange, unplaceable. The words didn't enter through my ears so much as slide straight into my brain, bypassing all conscious processing. She told me I didn't need my car, that mechanical things were unnecessary now. I should abandon it, she insisted, and follow the sound. Let the music guide me to the other shore, where everything would be explained. My hands shook as I yanked the door open and practically fell into the driver's seat. The familiar scent of leather, coffee, and pine-scented air freshener momentarily grounded me. This was real. This was mine. Whatever was happening outside belonged to another world, one I refused to enter. I started the engine, though I had no idea where I thought I could drive in fog like this. The headlights cut a shallow cone into the gray, barely reaching more than a meter before being swallowed whole. Still, the vibration of the engine and the low hum of the dashboard radio gave me something to hold on to. Outside, the carnival music danced on, cheerful and false, while that velvet voice kept whispering suggestions that made my skin crawl. Then the voice grew bolder. She knew things she couldn't. My name, my job at the mining company, the fight I'd had with my girlfriend 3 days ago. She described the contents of my wallet, the scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. She spoke of the dreams that had plagued me for weeks, dreams I had never told anyone about. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. She wasn't describing things that could be seen or guessed. She was describing me, my thoughts, my memories. My breath grew short and panicked. Each inhale felt insufficient. The music seemed to sync with my heartbeat, growing faster as my anxiety surged. I slammed my hand against the horn. A long, desperate blast. But the sound that emerged wasn't the shrill blare I knew. It was something else. Something that sounded eerily like laughter. The fog began to change. At first, I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks, stress conjuring movement out of stillness. But no, shapes were forming within the haze. Tall, slender figures moved in time with the carnival music, their limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. They pressed against my windows without leaving a trace, yet somehow their presence shifted the air around them. The fog's density responded to them. I tried to reason through it. Pareidolia, I told myself, the mind's tendency to find faces in randomness. But the voice wouldn't stop. It continued whispering dark truths and buried memories. She spoke of a recurring dream I'd had, walking endlessly through abandoned mining tunnels, shouting for help that never came. She described the strange rock formation I'd found last week, the one that seemed to hum when I pressed my palm against it. Worst of all, she knew about the feeling I couldn't shake, that something had been following me, watching, waiting for the right moment to make contact. Desperate, I fumbled for my phone, hoping for a signal. None. Not surprising, given where we were. But even the display looked wrong. The time ticked through impossible numbers. The date flickered between today and days that hadn't yet come to pass. Outside, the ferry's motion changed. We were turning, deliberately, but toward what I couldn't say. The engine noise shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as it took on new harmonics, weaving itself into the rhythm of the carnival music. Together, they formed a complex, dissonant pattern that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I closed my eyes, desperate to center myself, to find even a thread of clarity in the chaos. But behind my lids, the images only intensified. The fog figures kept dancing, grotesque silhouettes pulsing with the music. And over it all, the velvet voice returned, describing with clinical precision the exact expression of fear twisting across my face. She laughed softly, mockingly, at my attempt to shut her out. Closing my eyes, she said, only made it easier for her to show me the things I didn't want to see. The visions came fast and unbidden. I saw the mining facility where I worked, though it was twisted wrong. The corridors stretched impossibly deep, extending far beyond their actual blueprints. The machinery thrummed in perfect sync with that rock I'd touched last week, the one that had seemed to resonate with some buried ancient frequency. In the vision, I wandered the tunnels night after night, drawn by a sound I couldn't place, following it always deeper, always down. The voice whispered that I had been chosen. My time in the mines hadn't just exposed me to dust and danger. It had uncovered something patient, watching, waiting. That rock wasn't a mineral formation. It was a door, a beacon, a summoning stone that had waited decades for the right touch. My touch. I opened my eyes as the ferry lurched to a halt. The music cut out abruptly. The silence that followed was unbearable. Only the water lapping against the hull and my own ragged breath remained. The fog was still thick, but the quality of the light had changed. I couldn't see the source, but the air itself pulsed with a strange, charged glow. My skin prickled. My scalp tingled. Every hair stood on end. Then the velvet voice returned. Not through the speakers, but everywhere. Inside me, outside me, all around. She thanked me for coming, for offering myself so willingly. The crossing, she said, was complete. I had arrived. But this wasn't the other shore. The fog lifted slowly, revealing not the familiar dock, not the parking lot I had left behind, but a black, endless expanse of water stretching in every direction. A vast underground lake had taken the ferry into its impossible depths. There was no ceiling, just emptiness above, and the fairy now floated at the center of a cavern too large to exist. Phosphorescent minerals glimmered along the distant walls, casting a dim green-blue glow over everything, turning my skin corpse-pale in its eerie light. Somehow, impossibly, we had descended through rock, through reason, into a hidden world. The mining facility must sit above this place, its deepest tunnels brushing the edges of this subterranean ocean. There was no other way to explain it, and yet, explanation no longer mattered. She was no longer just a voice. She stood on the deck beside my car, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Her body glowed with the same phosphorescence as the cavern walls. Her eyes held depths that made me feel small, ancient wells of knowing that had nothing to do with human time. She wasn't a woman. Not really. Despite the perfection of her form, she was something else. Something older. Something vast. She told me I had been calling to her for weeks, that when I touched the stone, I had activated a signal, broadcasting my thoughts, my loneliness, my desperation. She answered, as she always did when one of her stones was touched. The miners uncovered them sometimes, she said. Most ignored them. Some did not. The fairy, she explained, would return to the surface without me. It would carry my empty car back across the lake. The security cameras would show only a man disappearing into the fog. My girlfriend would grieve. My co-workers would speculate. But eventually they would move on. I, however, would stay. Down here in the stillness and the dark. She promised peace, companionship, purpose. No more noise. No more fear. No more pretending to be fine. All I had to do was step out of the car. Just one step. My hand trembled on the door handle. Her glowing eyes held mine, soft and patient, waiting. I could feel my resistance dissolving like mist. The carnival music started again, gentler this time, less maddening, almost welcoming. The fog continued to recede, revealing figures standing along the deck's edge. Others like me, dozens, perhaps hundreds, each radiant with the same ghostly glow, each wearing a look of calm satisfaction. Some wore mining gear from decades ago, others more recent. They smiled and beckoned. Their peace was contagious. I smiled back. My hand turned the handle. After all, some crossings are never meant to go both ways. Their pages yellowed to the color of bone. As evening crept across the forest, I unpacked by the light of a single lamp that cast harsh angles across the main room. My shadow stretched across the opposite wall, dark and familiar. But when I raised my hand to scratch my neck, the shadow's movement came a half-second too late, like it was following a delayed transmission of my actions. My pulse quickened. I dropped my hand and watched the shadow do the same, again with that subtle lag. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Poor lighting, old electrical wiring causing the bulb to flicker imperceptibly, the altitude affecting my perception. But my body knew something was wrong. Sweat gathered at the base of my skull despite the cabin's chill. I forced myself to continue unpacking, keeping my movements deliberate and slow, watching the shadow from the corner of my eye. Sometimes it matched my pace perfectly. Other times it seemed to hesitate, as if considering whether to obey. That first night I woke to whispers. The sounds drifted through the cabin walls like smoke, too faint to understand, but too distinct to ignore. My mouth went dry as I strained to listen, every nerve ending firing signals of danger to a brain that desperately wanted to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the ceiling, the space beneath the floorboards. I fumbled for the lamp, my fingers clumsy with panic. Light flooded the room, and the whispers stopped, as if someone had pressed a mute button. But my shadow on the wall wasn't alone anymore. Other shadows clustered around it, shapeless, dark forms that had no corresponding objects to cast them. My heart hammered against my ribs like something trapped and desperate to escape. I spun around, searching for the sources of those impossible shadows, but the room was empty, except for my scattered belongings and the smell of fierce sweat pouring from my skin. When I turned back to the wall, the extra shadows were gone. Only mine remained, and it was perfectly in sync with my movements. Sleep didn't come again that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the forest beyond the glass. The trees stood motionless in the still air, their branches reaching toward the cabin like gnarled fingers. But shadows moved between the trunks. Not the soft, shifting darkness of wind-blown leaves, but purposeful shapes that seemed to patrol the perimeter of my new home. By morning, my hands shook when I tried to make coffee. The whispers returned as soon as darkness fell the next day, clearer now, almost conversational. They spoke of things buried deep in the mountain soil, of promises made and broken, of freedoms denied for too long. The words felt familiar, as if I'd heard them in dreams I couldn't quite remember. My shadow began to move independently during the day, shifting positions when I wasn't looking directly at it. I would catch glimpses of it gesturing when my hands were still, turning its head when mine faced forward. The sight sent waves of nausea through my stomach and made my skin crawl like it was covered in insects. On the third night, the whispers became urgent. They told me about the source, something ancient that slumbered in the deepest part of the forest, something that had been drawing shadows to itself for generations, collecting them like a miser hoarding coins. The whispers insisted that I was the key, that I could release them from their bondage, if I was brave enough to venture into the woods. I refused, clinging to the last threads of rationality. But my shadow began to rebel. It would disappear entirely for hours at a time, leaving me standing in lamplight without the dark companion that had followed me my entire life. During those shadowless periods, I felt naked, exposed, like part of my soul had been torn away. When the shadow returned, it brought others. They clustered on the walls around me, stretching and reaching, their movements becoming more frantic with each passing hour. The whispers grew into a constant murmur, overlapping voices that spoke of freedom and revenge, and the sweet taste of moonlight on skin that hadn't felt its touch in decades. My throat became permanently parched, my breathing shallow and rapid. Every sound made me jump. The settling of old wood, the rustle of something moving outside the windows, the creak of floorboards under feet that might not have been mine. Paranoia wrapped around my thoughts like barbed wire, convincing me that the forest itself was alive, and watching, waiting for me to make the choice that would either save or damn us all. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had turned into screams, and my shadow was writhing on the wall like it was in agony. The sight of its torment sent sympathetic pain through my chest. Whatever this was, it had to end. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the forest. The trees closed around me like a living tunnel, their branches knitting overhead, sealing away the star-scattered sky. My flashlight carved a narrow path through the dark, lighting up moss-covered trunks and catching occasional glints of eyes, creatures I couldn't name. The whispers led me deeper in. Now they came from my own mouth unbidden. My lips moved on their own, speaking a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was the language of shadows, of things that live in the space between light and dark. The forest floor sloped downward, leading me into a valley I'd never seen on any map. The trees here were wrong, twisted into impossible shapes, bark black as charcoal, their leaves rustling with the sound of distant weeping. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs like water. At the heart of the valley stood something that may once have been a tree. Its trunk spanned at least 20 feet across, but it had no bark. Its surface was smooth, like polished obsidian. No branches, just a column rising straight into the canopy. And covering every inch of it, shadows. Thousands of them, writhing in a silent dance of agony. My shadow leapt from my feet and joined them, as if reuniting with long-lost kin. I staggered back, winded by the loss. Without my shadow, I felt incomplete, exposed in ways I had never imagined. The tree pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and as I stepped closer, I saw it. The shadows weren't just crawling along the surface. They were inside the tree, trapped within layers of obsidian like insects in amber. Some were human-shaped, others not. A few weren't even recognizably alive. All reached toward me in desperate, grasping motions. Then the realization struck. This thing had been collecting shadows for centuries. Millennia, perhaps. Anyone or anything who'd come too close to the valley had lost their shadow to it. Now it wanted to keep mine. Forever. The whispers had lied. I wasn't the key to their freedom. I was the final piece of whatever dark puzzle this ancient thing had been building. My shadow had been marked the moment I stepped into that cabin, drawn here by forces I couldn't begin to understand. The tree's pulse quickened. Cracks split open along the obsidian surface. Shadows clawed at the fractures from within, their screams silent but visible in the way they scratched and pressed against their prison. I saw my own shadow among them, familiar, but barely distinguishable now. I knew what I had to do. My flashlight felt impossibly heavy as I raised it like a weapon. This thing had lived in the dark so long, it had forgotten the power of focused light. I flipped the beam to its highest setting and aimed at the widest crack. The light hit the obsidian and split, refracting into dozens of beams that found every weakness, every fracture. The tree shuddered, making a sound like breaking glass and distant screams. More cracks bloomed across the surface. Then the shadows began to pour out. One by one, they slipped through the gaps, solid, tangible in the flashlight's glare. They looked at me, some with gratitude, others with terror, and fled